Wayne, let's start with some exclusive news from Football Insider involving Manchester City and Saudi League pro star Ruben Neves.
Yes, the story on Football Insider today that Man City have a concrete interest in Ruben Neves going into the January transfer window. They're very keen on him, and they are looking for a central midfielder next year, both January and then in the summer if they don't get that player in January. And obviously, everyone knows that Calvin Phillips hasn't been playing. Pep Guardiola doesn't fancy him, doesn't play him, and will do sort of anything to avoid picking him seemingly. And he will leave Man City next year. It might not be in January. It might not be in the summer, but it's very likely he will go in the winter window. Man City want to bring in a top-tier replacement. Guardiola's a massive fan of Neves, always has been actually, going back 3 or 4 years. I'm told he's a Guardiola type of player in terms of both his profile and character and ability to take on tactical instructions. And Man City are very keen. And obviously, with the big sort of Newcastle saga, Newcastle could get might not be able to sign him, whereas Man City won't have that issue.
And Pete, in terms of their squad currently, like sort of Wayne has mentioned, he's been favoured by Pep for a few years, but considering how strong their midfield is already, how likely is he to get game time with the likes of, actually someone in a similar position, people like Bernardo Silva or in a box-to-box role? Would he come in and fill that Gundogan role? Where would he sit in the squad?
Yeah, obviously, as Wayne's mentioned, I think Pep Guardiola is a big fan of Ruben Neves. For me, he's probably better playing in a more withdrawn role, maybe, but he's going to find it hard to get in ahead of Rodri in that defensive midfield role, which he really performed well for Wolves. He was a defensive midfielder in a double pivot with João Moutinho, and those two had a great combination together. And then obviously he's made this big money move to the Saudi Pro League. Hasn't really worked out probably as well as he expected, and he is interested in a move back to the Premier League. But if you look at it this way, if Manchester City come calling, it's going to be hard for any player to turn down. Obviously, Calvin Phillips made that big move from Leeds United. It didn't work out for him as he had hoped. And it does seem he will move on probably this January transfer window as well. Ruben Neves, I'm sure he would back himself, his quality, maybe to get into that Man City squad, but it's a star-studded lineup. It's hard to get into as well. And you've also got the fact that Kevin De Bruyne will be coming back from injury soon as well, so it just increases competition for places even more in that City side. But I think Ruben Neves, if City do allow Calvin Phillips to move on in January, I think Ruben Neves would be a good replacement, and it would probably be somebody who could go in there, hit the ground running from his Premier League experience as well. And
the really interesting thing is, he's made this move in the summer to the Saudi League, and the original plan was never to go for very long. So, for Neves and his camp, it was just to make a sort of short move to get the money. Obviously, wild riches beyond sort of most players' dreams. And then the plan was to actually go to Newcastle because the association between the Saudi clubs and Newcastle, same ownership effectively through the Saudi investment fund. But that looks to have blown up in his face. What with the Premier League has been voting on that next week, and if they get 14 votes, then these kind of associated party deals could end very quickly, which would open the door for another club like Man City. So the player may still get his move, but Newcastle would lose out.
And, you both mentioned there in terms of outgoings that there's obviously talk about Calvin Phillips. Now, Pete, do you see Calvin Phillips moving in January, and which clubs are interested if so?
Yeah, I think Manchester City won't stand in his way if a suitable offer does come in for Calvin Phillips in January. Juventus in Italy are in the market for a defensive midfielder. Calvin Phillips is one name that they have discussed. He's pretty high up on their list, and it's a move that Calvin Phillips hasn't ruled out either. I think his preference would be to stay in the Premier League if somebody does make an offer to Manchester City as well. Newcastle, if they're going to miss out on Ruben Neves, Calvin Phillips wouldn't be a bad second choice, would he? So I think Newcastle are very much in the race for Calvin Phillips in the January transfer window. We all know Newcastle's need for a midfielder following Sandro Tonoli's suspension as well. So it could be a ready-made replacement to go into Eddie Howe's starting lineup next season as well. West Ham have been long-term admirers of Calvin Phillips. Liverpool also in that market for a defensive midfielder as well. They do like Calvin Phillips as well, but whether they would allow Calvin Phillips to go to a rival in Liverpool, Manchester City, that'll have to be seen, I think. I'm not too sure they would be willing to do that, with both teams maybe fighting it out for the Premier League title this year as well. But if Calvin Phillips, I'm sure, will not be short of options come the January transfer window as well. The player himself, I think he realises now that it's not going to work out for him at Manchester City, and he needs to be playing regular first-team football, considering the Euros coming up in the summer with England. He wants to be match fit and ready for that tournament as well.
I mean, the writing was on the wall, wasn't it, when he came back from the World Cup, and Guardiola sort of questioned his physical status, basically said he was out of shape and wasn't in a condition to play for Man City, which was pretty public humiliation and also quite embarrassing, wasn't it, for a top-level professional footballer. And he had barely played beforehand, and he's barely played since. So, I think the City managers dropped the sort of most public possible hints that he doesn't see him as part of his long-term plans. And if you're Phillips, peak of his career seemingly, at a really good age, got loads of good Premier League experience, and a fine player for most Premier League clubs, if not Man City, then you have to move, don't you? You have to get the right club this time, but yeah, definitely get moved to a club where you can play regularly.
And Wayne, as Pete mentioned, sounds like Newcastle, West Ham and Liverpool are interested. Out of those three, if you had three offers on the table, where do you think Phillips should go out of those choices, and why?
I think Newcastle are in pole position and definitely the favourites. They've got a massive injury list at the moment. I mean, more than 10 players are injured. You could see at Bournemouth on Saturday, as Kieran Trippier made very, very plain to those Newcastle fans that they're really struggling. They're really struggling in midfield. And you look at the team on Saturday night; it's pretty much a Steve Bruce team, wasn't it? Most of those players were around Bruce was managers, so they are really short at the moment. They need strength and reinforcements in central midfield. Phillips is available, and I think their pole position. I think a loan deal is probably the most likely, or maybe a loan to buy. West Ham in the background. I think Pete's written a few stories about Thomas Souček's future being up in the air. He's out of contract at the end of the season. David Moyes, another admirer there, but will he be manager at the end of the season at West Ham? So that's definitely a strong possibility. I'm quite interested in Pete saying Liverpool. I mean, do you think Pete Phillips has got the mobility to play in the Liverpool midfield? Because Liverpool do struggle a bit with the counter-attacks, and I think that's the issue that Guardiola has with Phillips, isn't it? Is kind of his ability to stop those quick turnovers. I mean, could you see him fitting in at Liverpool?
Yeah, I think obviously Liverpool would have reservations maybe about his mobility, but I think going right now, you look at Liverpool, Alexis McAllister isn't the answer for that number 6 role. No. He needs to be playing further forward like he was at Brighton. That's where he was most effective. He's shown that for Brighton and also for Argentina as well. So I think Calvin Phillips, as a designated defensive midfielder, would be an improvement in that Liverpool midfield right now as well. If you get back to what he showed at Leeds when he was a mobile midfielder under Marcelo Bielsa, and there's no other manager who wants mobile players than Marcelo Bielsa, considering the transitions and the counter-pressing that they did as well. So if you can get a fit and firing Calvin Phillips, I think he could be a good signing for a lot of clubs. Liverpool do like him, but I just don't see Manchester City, although Pep Guardiola has said he's not afraid to let players join rivals, whether they would let Calvin Phillips go to Liverpool. And I'm sure Liverpool, as we all know, are scouring the market for other alternatives for that defensive midfielder role as well. Looking at Andre from Fluminense, who is a younger player as well with huge potential, maybe ticks the criteria boxes more for Liverpool than Calvin Phillips as well. But I'm sure whoever does get Calvin Phillips in January will get a hungry and determined player, maybe to prove a point, because he's really become a forgotten man at Manchester City.
Do you think Andre gets done in January, Pete?
A lot of reports earlier in the last couple of months were suggesting that Liverpool were leading the race for him, but those have gone a bit quiet right now as well. Obviously, Fluminense are willing to sell Andre in this January transfer window for around £30 million, which isn't a massive amount right now as well. He's a Brazil international, quality player, helped them win the Copa Libertadores as well. Does seem to be a lot of interest in him from elsewhere as well. So there's talk of Arsenal interested, Fulham also long-term admirers as well, and there's also been suggestions that Tottenham could be in the market for Andre as well. And they also are looking at the Calvin Phillips situation as well. They are looking at that CDM for January as well, but a lot will depend if Pierre-Emile Højbjerg possibly leaves as well. I don't think Spurs will leave themselves short as a bit like Newcastle, struggling with injuries and selection problems right now as well. So Ange Postecoglou, I'm sure, will be seeing what is out there in the market right now as well. And Calvin Phillips is somebody who's on their list, as he's on the list of a number of other clubs along with Andre. So yeah, it could be a huge midfield merry-go-round, I think, in the Premier League this coming January transfer window.
You've just watched a segment from Football Insider's brand new podcast, The Inside Track, with me, Lewis Pearce, alongside the guests on the show. Thanks very much for tuning in. Please do give the video a like, comment your thoughts on the topic, and feel free to share on your social media pages. If you want to listen to the full podcast episode, click the link in the description below. Keep your eyes peeled for plenty more content and exclusives here on The Inside Track.